Supreme Court's draft decision to overturn Roe v. Wade is top of mind across the nation right now. But I want to begin tonight with a different ruling, one from 1954. That was the year the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Brown v. Board that racial segregation of children in public schools was unconstitutional. The lawyers who argued the case before the Supreme Court and won included the future Supreme Court Justice, this man, Thurgood Marshall. He and his co-counsel stood outside the court after the ruling to celebrate the victory. They expressed a hope and expectation that Southern segregationist states would comply.
It is my opinion that the South will be law-abiding and will comply with the decision of the court and accept it as members of our democratic society.
I don't think there's any question about it in the South. People in the South are just as law-abiding as anybody else, and other decisions have come down which they said they wouldn't like, and there's never been any trouble as a result of any of these decisions.
It's maybe a bit of ironic foreshadowing there, because there were, of course, several critics of the ruling, mostly from Southern segregationist states. One of the most vociferous critics of that decision, even years later, was this man, Jerry Falwell, one of the most prominent leaders of the evangelical movement in America. This is a little bit of a sermon that he gave to his congregation in Lynchburg, Virginia, years after that ruling was rendered. Quote, "If Chief Justice Warren and his associates had known God's word and had desired to do the Lord's will, I am quite confident that the 1954 decision would never have been made. The facility should be separate. When God has drawn a line of distinction, we should not attempt to cross that line. The true Negro does not want integration. He realizes his potential is far better among his own race," end quote. Falwell went on to assert that integration, quote, "will destroy our race eventually." In the aftermath of Brown v. Board, segregation became a motivating factor, including for the evangelical movement. More than 3,000 private schools and academies popped up in the years after the ruling. White students instructed separately and apart from black students, despite the court decision. Some of those institutions included Falwell's Lynchburg Christian Academy, which was founded in 1967. Years after the Brown v. Board decision, when the government tried to deny tax-exempt status to segregated private schools, folks like Jerry Falwell were enraged. Other schools, like the fundamentalist Bob Jones University, went to court over the matter, arguing that racial segregation was a religious matter. They lost. The decision was nearly unanimous. The history shows that the pioneers of the evangelical movement, for people like Jerry Falwell, segregation was a motivating factor long before abortion was. In fact, in 1973, when the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade, evangelicals weren't exactly motivated by Roe. In fact, the former president of America's largest Protestant denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, actually endorsed the ruling, Roe v. Wade. He said, quote, "I've always felt that it was only after a child was born and had a life separate from its mother that it became an individual person. And it has always, therefore, seemed to me that what is best for the mother and the future should be allowed," end quote. In fact, in 1971, before the decision in Roe v. Wade, that same Protestant group resolved to seek pro-abortion legislation, allowing the procedure in certain cases, and they reaffirmed that resolution in the year after Roe, in 1974, pushing for legislation that would allow people to choose abortion in specific instances. It was not until years after the Roe ruling that the evangelical movement decided that coalescing around abortion was the way to unify religious groups and gain political power. The anger of evangelicals was activated by segregation, but continued segregation would prove to be a less than palatable way to motivate evangelical voters on a broad scale, not enough to win elections with. So that's where the issue of abortion came in. Senate races in Minnesota and Iowa in 1978 showed that an anti-abortion, pro-life movement could unite the religious right and give them real political power. In Minnesota, pro-life Republicans won 2 Senate seats. In Iowa, the Democratic incumbent, Senator Dick Clark, was expected to win by a landslide. He did not, primarily due to the work of mostly Catholic pro-life activists. Clark had supported federal funding for abortions for low-income women. He had opposed an amendment that would restrict abortions, so anti-abortion activists rallied support to vote him out.
Richard Clark, 6 years in the U.S. Senate and then out on one issue, the one political insiders said didn't matter.
I had voted for public funding of abortion. I'd refused to sponsor a constitutional amendment to support that, and my opponent said that he would. So it was a clear-cut case, one of the clearest in the United States, I think, in the Senate races.
The anti-abortion movement has political clout. That surprised a lot of journalists and political analysts who believed those people made a lot of noise, but not much difference.
After those 1978 races, those people resolved to make a whole lot more noise, and in a very organized way. In a letter to fellow conservatives, or to a fellow conservative, another conservative activist and the leader of the religious right, Paul Weyrich, characterized those anti-abortion victories as, quote, true cause for celebration. Another conservative activist predicted that opposition to abortion would, quote, pull together many of our fringe Christian friends, end quote. But that was the plan, to bottle up all of that ire that evangelicals felt about segregation and concentrate it on abortion, making sweeping moral arguments against health care that they claimed was founded in religion. That was the plan to build political power, and Republican politicians campaigned accordingly. In 1980, the Republican candidate for president, Ronald Reagan, campaigned on a constitutional amendment prohibiting abortion. It's one of the issues that helped send him to the White House. He gained the support of those opposed to abortion, and he won the presidency, ousting Jimmy Carter. The 1980s saw the Reagan administration focus increasingly on abortion and the rise of the Federalist Society and a trend toward strict textualists like this man, Robert Bork, a failed Supreme Court nominee who criticized the justice who wrote the Brown v. Board decision. That trend continued through the Trump administration. In 2015, Trump courted and forged a coalition with the religious right, with figures like Jerry Falwell Jr., to secure their backing and their funding. He notoriously released a list of conservative justices whom he would nominate if elected. His then running mate pledged during their campaign that their judicial nominees would bring an end to Roe once and for all.
We appoint strict constructionists to the Supreme Court of the United States, as Donald Trump intends to do. I believe we will see Roe versus Wade consigned to the ash heap of history where it belongs. I promise.
And they did. Trump appointed 3 conservative judges. And this week, with the leaked draft opinion condemning Roe to the, quote, ash heap, we can see how this all is very likely to shake out. With Roe gone, minority women will likely bear the brunt of this new upcoming restriction on their health care in roughly half the country, not to mention the fact that the draft opinion is written in a way that could dismantle other rights. Things like the right to same-sex marriage, the right to contraception, interracial marriage, privacy, all of these things are now on the table. The religious right charted this course decades ago in their anger over segregation to build power on the back of abortion and dismantle the rights they don't care for. And so far, it seems to be working.